You worked with your hands your whole life, and you think that makes you a man? Real men build empires, not fences. My son said that to me on my 68th birthday, in front of 40 of his closest friends, in a backyard I'd poured the concrete for with my own two hands 11 years earlier. I remember the exact moment his voice cut through the party. I was standing near the grill, holding a plate of ribs I'd smoked since 4 that morning, and Marcus, my son, stood up from the head of the long table Diane had rented for the occasion, tapped his wine glass with a fork, and told everyone he had an announcement. I thought maybe he was finally going to say something kind about his old man. Instead, he looked right at me, smiled the way he does when he's about to humiliate someone in a room full of witnesses, and said the man standing at the grill in an apron had spent 40 years fixing other people's air conditioners while his stepfather, Rex, built a company worth 11 figures from nothing. He said Rex was the kind of man he wanted to be. He said I was, in his exact words, a nice guy who never amounted to anything, and he was tired of pretending otherwise just because it was my birthday. 40 people went quiet. My daughter-in-law Priya put her hand over her mouth. Someone's fork clinked against a plate and then stopped entirely. My ex-wife, Diane, the mother of my only son, sat there next to Rex, her second husband, and said nothing. Rex leaned back in his lawn chair with a glass of scotch he'd brought himself because he said my beer selection was, quote, blue collar, and he smiled at me the way a man smiles when he's already won something and wants you to know it. And me? I set the plate of ribs down on the table very carefully, because I didn't want my hands shaking to give anything away, and I looked at my son, and I said, happy to hear it, son. That's all. 2 words. Then I sat back down and finished my dinner like nothing had happened, and I let the party continue around me like a man who'd just been told the weather was going to be nice on Tuesday. But here's what none of them knew. Sitting there in my backyard, eating food I'd cooked, drinking beer I'd bought, celebrating on a patio I'd built with concrete I'd mixed by hand back when Marcus was 17 and too busy with his friends to help me. None of them knew that the empire Marcus was so proud of, the one he credited entirely to his own genius and his stepfather's guidance, had never once stood on its own. Every wall of it, every brick, had been placed there quietly by me, and with a single phone call I was planning to make in exactly 9 days, the entire thing was going to come apart like wet paper in the rain. My name is Walt Kowalski. I'm 68 years old, and for 41 years I ran a heating and cooling repair business out of a shop on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, the kind of business you build one satisfied customer at a time, not the kind that gets written up in magazines. I want to tell you exactly what happened over those 9 days, because even now, months later, I'm still turning it over in my head, trying to understand how a boy I raised could look at me the way Marcus looked at me that night. And I want you, whoever's listening to this, wherever you are right now, to ask yourself honestly what you would have done in my shoes. I didn't raise a cruel son. I need to say that up front, because it would be easy for me to tell this story and make Marcus into a monster from the very first sentence, and that wouldn't be fair, and it wouldn't be true. Marcus was a sweet kid once. He used to ride in my truck with me on Saturday mornings, handing me wrenches before I even asked for them, memorizing the names of parts most grown men never learn. He was mine before he was anyone else's. But when he was 19, Diane left, and she took something from him that I couldn't fight for in any courtroom, and that was his idea of what a man was supposed to look like. Diane had grown up poor in a way that never really left her, the kind of poor that makes a person terrified of being thought of as small for the rest of their life. She met Rex Callahan at a real estate seminar 8 months after our divorce was final, and Rex was everything I wasn't. He wore watches that cost more than my truck. He talked in a voice that filled up a room even when he was saying nothing important. He built strip malls and self-storage complexes across 3 states, and he made sure everyone around him knew the square footage of every single one. Diane married him 14 months after we split, and from that day on, every conversation Marcus had with his mother came with a comparison built into it, whether she meant it that way or not. Rex has a plane. Rex just bought a 4th property. Rex says hard work is for people who don't know how to make money work for them instead. And Marcus, 19 years old, and desperate for his mother's approval in the way boys are, when their whole world has just been rearranged without their permission, absorbed every word of it like scripture. The dinner where he humiliated me wasn't an accident, and it wasn't even really about the birthday. It was the culmination of years of Rex, quietly, patiently, teaching my son that the value of a man could be measured in a bank statement, and years of Diane never once correcting him, because correcting Marcus would have meant admitting that the life she'd chosen for herself required her to look down on the life she used to have with me. Here's the story turn I need you to stay with me for, because this is where you'll understand exactly how badly all three of them had misjudged the quiet man standing at that grill. 9 years earlier, Marcus had come to me with an idea. He wanted to start a company that installed smart climate systems in luxury homes, high-efficiency units connected to apps, the kind of thing that was just starting to catch on with people who had more money than patience. He had the technical instincts for it, I'll give him that. He'd learned enough from riding with me on those Saturday mornings to actually understand the mechanics, even if he'd never admit that's where the knowledge came from. But he had no capital, no credit, and no discipline, and I knew if I simply wrote him a check for the $400,000 he was asking for, he'd burn through it in 18 months trying to look successful before he ever became successful, and he'd learn nothing except how to ask his father for money. So I told him something different. I told him my money was tied up in the business and in a retirement account I couldn't touch, which was, technically, not entirely a lie. Marcus called me small-minded. He said I didn't understand ambition. He walked away disappointed, and 2 weeks later, he found what he thought was a private investment group out of Columbus, willing to fund promising young entrepreneurs in the home services technology space. What Marcus never knew, not once in 9 years, was that the private investment group was mine. I had spent 3 months setting it up with the help of a lawyer named Sheila Okafor, a woman I'd trusted since she'd handled the sale of my own shop's building a decade earlier. We formed a holding company registered in Delaware, hired a retired engineering professor named Dr. Ellis Broom to sit as the friendly public face of the firm, a man with just enough credibility and just enough need for extra income in retirement to keep his mouth shut and cash his quarterly check. Marcus pitched his idea to Dr. Broom in a rented conference room in Columbus, walked out 2 hours later with $400,000 in seed funding, and never once asked why a stranger had believed in him so completely on the very first meeting. The company was structured so that the holding company owned 58%. Marcus, as founder and CEO, held 22%, with the rest split among 2 early employees he'd recruited. Which meant, in plain terms, that my son did not own his own company. He was its most senior employee, drawing a generous salary and calling himself an owner, while an invisible board he had never met, and would never think to trace back to me, held the real control. Then there was the truck, the one Marcus drove to work every day, a black extended cab pickup with his company logo wrapped across both doors, the kind of vehicle he'd point to when he wanted new clients to see he was a serious businessman and not some kid playing at it. His personal credit had been too thin when the company was young to lease something that expensive on his own, so the company leased it instead, through a fleet management firm that Marcus believed was an independent vendor. It wasn't. It was a subsidiary of my holding company, 3 layers removed, with a contract that stated plainly that the vehicle reverted to the leasing entity the moment Marcus ceased to be an active, in good standing officer of the company. And then, the biggest piece, the house. The 7-bedroom colonial in Shaker Heights that Marcus and Priya had fallen in love with 2 years after the wedding, the one with the wraparound porch and the koi pond that Diane bragged about at every family gathering like she'd built it with her own hands. Marcus had asked me for help with the down payment, and I'd told him no, told him it was reckless to stretch that far on a house before the company had even turned a real profit. What I never told him was that I'd bought that entire property through a separate LLC 3 years before he and Priya ever laid eyes on it, back when the neighborhood was still considered a risky bet and the previous owners were desperate to sell. When Marcus and Priya went looking for their dream home, a property manager who worked quietly for me reached out to them with an unusually generous financing arrangement designed specifically to make a young, image-conscious CEO feel like he'd been hand-selected for something special. He never suspected a thing, not once in 9 years. Because the truth was so much simpler and so much more humiliating than any conspiracy he could have imagined. His own father, the man he called a nice guy who never amounted to anything, had built the entire floor beneath his feet, brick by brick, in total silence, expecting nothing back except maybe, someday, a small measure of respect. I want to slow down here for a moment, because this next part is the part I've replayed in my head more than any other, and I think it deserves to be told slowly, the way it actually happened to me, minute by minute, instead of rushed through like it was nothing. 3 days after the birthday party, I sat in the back office of my old shop, the one I still kept even after I'd mostly handed the daily repairs over to younger men I'd trained myself, and I called Sheila. I told her it was time. She asked me twice if I was certain, because once we pulled the threads, there'd be no quiet way to put them back. I told her I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. So we started, methodically, the way I used to diagnose a failing furnace, checking one system at a time until you find the part that's actually broken. First, the holding company's board, which was me, formally voted to restructure its relationship with Marcus's company, citing performance concerns that Sheila had spent 2 days documenting in painstaking, defensible detail. The change reduced Marcus's operational authority and required an immediate audit of company spending, an audit that would inevitably reveal the truth about who actually controlled 58% of everything he'd built his identity around. Second, the fleet management firm sent notice that the lease agreement on the truck was under review due to the same audit, with a formal notice that use of the vehicle should be suspended pending resolution. Third, and this was the one Sheila warned me might feel the most personal, the property manager overseeing the Shaker Heights house began a routine review of the original financing arrangement, the kind of review that would eventually surface the true ownership of the LLC behind it. I didn't do this quickly. I gave it 9 days, exactly 9, because I wanted each piece to land on its own before the next one hit, the way a good contractor sequences work so nothing collapses all at once and nothing gets missed in the noise. Sheila told me most people, once they realize their whole financial life is a house of cards, panic within 72 hours of the first domino falling. Marcus lasted 6. On the 6th day, my phone rang at 11:40 at night. I almost didn't answer, because I'd had 6 days of Diane calling and texting, demanding to know if I'd lost my mind, and I assumed it was another one of those. But it was Marcus, and his voice, when I picked up, didn't sound anything like the man who'd stood up at that birthday dinner and called me a nice guy who never amounted to anything. It sounded like a boy again, scared, the way he used to sound when he was 7 years old and thought there was something in his closet. He said the board had frozen his authority. He said the truck company had sent someone to repossess the vehicle from the parking lot outside his own office, in front of his employees. He said the bank handling the house financing was asking questions nobody could answer, and Priya was terrified they were going to lose the house. He asked me, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, if I knew anything about any of it, if maybe I still had contacts from my old business dealings, who could help him figure out who was doing this to him. And I said, calm as I've ever been in my life, come by the shop tomorrow morning, we should talk. He showed up the next day in a car that wasn't his, borrowed from a friend, because his own truck had been towed away 2 days earlier. He walked into the back office, where I'd spent 40 years fixing furnaces and air conditioners, the same office he used to think was boring when he was a kid, too small and too full of paperwork to interest him, and for the first time in his life, I watched him actually look around it, like he was seeing it for the first time and trying to understand what he'd missed. I didn't get up from behind my desk. I gestured to the chair across from me, the same worn-out chair every one of my employees had sat in for a performance review at some point over 4 decades, and I told him to sit down, that the yelling could wait, that first he needed to listen. He sat. His suit, the expensive one he wore for client meetings, was wrinkled like he'd slept in it. His hands were shaking. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't with the confidence of a man who ran a 9-figure company. It was with the voice of someone standing on ground that had just disappeared beneath him. Dad, what is happening to my company? I turned my laptop around so he could see the screen, and one by one I showed him. I showed him the incorporation documents for the holding company that owned 58% of everything he'd built his whole identity on top of. I showed him Dr. Broom's consulting agreement, the modest quarterly payment he'd received in exchange for sitting in one conference room 9 years ago and shaking a young man's hand. I told him, as gently as I could manage, that he had never owned his own company, that he was, and had always been, its most senior and most well-paid employee. He shook his head. He said it wasn't possible, that he'd built the company from nothing, that he remembered every meeting, every late night, every investor call. I didn't argue with him. I just clicked to the next document, the lease agreement on the truck, showing the fleet management firm 3 layers deep, owned by the same holding company. You never earned that truck, Marcus, I said. You were allowed to drive it, and when the arrangement no longer made sense, the permission ended. Then I showed him the deed to the house in Shaker Heights, my name, through the LLC, on every page of it. I explained there had never been a special financing offer, that a young CEO with a growing reputation had simply been a convenient tenant to install in a property I already owned, and that his behavior toward me had made the arrangement, as I put it, no longer something I wanted to continue. You weren't a rising star some investor spotted, son, I told him, keeping my voice level, because I'd learned a long time ago that quiet lands harder than shouting ever does. You were my son, living in my house, driving my truck, running a company I built underneath you so you'd have somewhere solid to stand. And at your own birthday dinner, in front of 40 people, you told everyone I never amounted to anything. The color drained out of his face the way it does when a man realizes every foundation he's ever stood on was poured by someone else's hands, someone he'd spent years being ashamed of. But I wasn't finished, because there was one more piece, and it was the one that mattered most to me, more than the company, more than the truck, more than the house. Let's talk about Rex, I said quietly. I opened one final folder and turned the screen back toward him. It was a consulting agreement between his company and a firm called Callahan Strategic Advisory, $42,000 a month, for what the paperwork vaguely described as executive mentorship and business development guidance. I asked my son if he'd ever wondered why Rex, a man who supposedly ran an empire spanning 3 states, seemed to have so much free time to mentor him personally, week after week, year after year. Marcus's eyes went wide. He didn't answer, because he already knew where this was going before I said another word. That $42,000 a month is the majority of Rex's actual income right now, son. His strip malls have been underwater for 2 years. 2 of his self-storage properties went into foreclosure last spring, and he's been quietly using your company as a lifeline so your mother never has to know how much of his empire has already crumbled. The man you called a real man at my own birthday party, the one you said built something out of nothing while I fixed air conditioners, has been living off a consulting contract funded entirely by money that started in my holding company and flowed straight through your business into his pocket. I let that sit in the room for a long moment, because some things need silence around them to be understood. The winner your mother left me for, I said, has been on the payroll of the losers she left behind. Marcus didn't say anything for almost a full minute. He just sat there in that worn chair, staring at the desk, and I watched something break in him that I think had needed to break for a very long time, not out of cruelty on my part, but out of necessity, the way you sometimes have to tear out rotten wood before you can build anything that'll actually hold weight. The days after that were quieter than any I'd known in a long time. No frantic calls from Diane demanding I fix what I'd broken. No manufactured family emergencies designed to pull me back into managing everyone else's feelings about their own choices. Just quiet. I was sitting on my back porch about 2 weeks later, the same porch where the whole thing had started, drinking coffee and watching the sun come up over the yard I'd built with my own hands, when my phone rang. It was Diane. I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted to hear what she had to say, so I picked up and just listened. She was in a full panic. Rex's remaining properties were being called in by the bank. The consulting contract was gone, obviously, and without it, the truth about his finances had come out all at once. Their house, the country club membership she'd been so proud to mention every chance she got, all of it was collapsing. And somehow, in the span of about 90 seconds, she made it entirely about how selfish and vindictive I was for destroying the life she'd built for herself. There was no apology in any of it. No mention of the dinner where our son had humiliated me in front of 40 people. No acknowledgement of 41 years I'd spent quietly providing a floor for people who'd never once thanked me for it. Just a demand, dressed up as heartbreak, that I fix what she considered mine to fix, because I still had the money, and she believed, somewhere deep down, that I always owed her something for staying with me as long as she had. I let her talk until she ran out of air. I watched a couple of birds land on the fence at the edge of the yard, and when I finally spoke, there wasn't any anger left in my voice at all, just a plain fact, stated the way I used to tell a customer their furnace was beyond repair. Diane, I said, that's not my problem anymore. I ended the call, set the phone face down on the little table beside my chair, and let the porch go quiet again. I'd spent 41 years being the foundation for people who never once looked down to notice I was there. And in the stillness of that morning, for the first time in longer than I could remember, the man everyone had called a nice guy who never amounted to anything finally felt, for the first time, like exactly what he was. So let me ask you something, before you go, because I really do want to know where you land on this. Comment 1 if you think I did exactly what needed to be done, that this was hard-earned justice, 41 years in the making. Comment 2 if you think I went too far, that pulling it all away at once was its own kind of cruelty, even if he deserved some of it. Or comment 3 if you think the real blame belongs to Diane and Rex, and Marcus was just a young man shaped by two people who never should have raised him to measure a man in dollars. And tell me, wherever you're watching this from tonight, what time it is where you are, because it always amazes me how far these stories travel. Have you ever had someone underestimate you, not knowing everything you were quietly capable of the whole time? I'd like to hear about it, so tell me down in the comments, because I read every single one.